I'm Lindsay Sturkey, and welcome to Simple Spiritual Practices. In each episode of this podcast, we'll talk about one tangible practice that will help you know yourself and God better. Most of these practices can be done in 5 minutes or less, so you can easily try it out today. If you are ready to experience real growth in your life, or if you want fresh ideas on how to approach your time with God, this podcast is for you. This past week, the girls went back to school and we finally got back into somewhat of a normal routine. So I talked in last week's episode about the power of starting slow, not trying to change everything at once in the new year. And for me, this week really just felt like a good, slow and steady return to a few habits and rhythms that really helped me feel more like myself again. Having time alone and the space to not only get refreshed, but also get some things done really did wonders for my soul. And so for most of the week, I felt pretty settled and at peace. But in the midst of that, I had several spikes of kind of intense anxiety. And as I was reflecting on that, I thought it might be helpful to talk about that today and share some of the tools and practices that helped me work through that. So I would not describe myself as an overly anxious person in general. My struggles with worry are kind of typical and generally not extreme. I tend to just kind of assume everything will work out, even though I do still feel anxious at times. And I know that some of you listening deeply struggle with anxiety. And this can be not only a spiritual issue, but a physical one as well. It can have a lot of layers. And if you are someone who struggles on a really deep level with anxiety, I just want to remind all of us that there are no quick fixes here. And maybe all of that goes without saying, but I never want to give the impression that I'm telling you to just say a prayer and praise God and your anxiety will magically go away. Because there are times when we need outside help to cope with anxiety, and that's okay. So what I'm going to talk about today are just some tools that will hopefully be helpful in the moment when you feel anxiety, but this is not meant to skip over the deeper things that might be going on. These are simply practices and tools that hopefully can help you fix your eyes on Jesus instead of the worry and the fear. So with all that being said, I'm just going to describe for you a little bit about my own moments of anxiety this week. So the first one was one of my kids was complaining about having a headache. And along with that, she was just kind of tired and just not completely herself. And I knew that probably it was just her being worn out from going back to school after the break. But still, my mind started going down this path of anxiety, and I started imagining all the different things that could be wrong. Now, I'm not going to describe those thoughts in detail because you probably have done the same thing yourself when it comes to your kids. But it's like all the what ifs start speaking really loudly in my head, and if you're like me, it can get dark pretty quickly. Even though logically I knew that she was probably fine, it wasn't a big deal, my heart still kind of got carried away with the anxiety to the point where I woke up in the middle of the night worrying with my mind racing. Now, she woke up the next morning completely fine, by the way, and it really was just that she was tired. It was nothing more than that. So another moment of anxiety came in the middle of the following night. So I heard one of the girls call out mommy, and as I got up out of bed to see what was going on, I quickly noticed how eerily quiet the house was. So apparently the power had gone out and my daughter was scared because it meant she didn't have her nightlight. So after getting her settled, I went back to bed just wondering, why is the power out? There's no storm. It wasn't even super low temperatures that night or anything else. So normally this would not feel like a big deal. But after everything that has happened in the last year, a random power outage just kind of got my mind going, wondering, what is happening? Was this just where we live, or was it a widespread thing? What if it didn't come back on? Could we actually even function without power if it was off for days or even weeks? Now again, in my logical brain, I knew that this anxiety I was feeling was pretty likely unfounded. A power outage is usually not that big of a deal, and sure enough, it was back on within a few hours before we even got up for the day. But for a while there in the middle of the night, I just couldn't stop my mind from going to anxiety. Now, the last experience I want to tell you about of anxiety is one that you may have had as well, as on Wednesday, I watched the news footage of what took place at the Capitol building in DC. And probably like many of you, I couldn't seem to tear my eyes away from what was happening, wondering what it meant, where it would lead, feeling sadness and heartbreak for just all the disunity in our country and fear for the future. I was scrolling on my phone way too much to see what everyone else was saying about it, and it became pretty consuming. So, all of that being said, what do we do when we feel ourselves pulled under by anxiety? How do we stop those racing thoughts, and how do we settle our hearts and our minds? Again, there are no easy answers here. There's not a quick fix. I really want to emphasize that this is a process and something we have to keep coming back to over and over again. But there are some practices and tools that really did help me work through my anxiety this week. And a reminder again that I'm speaking from my own experience of what helps me with just kind of that everyday run-of-the-mill anxiety. And I want to share those tools and practices here with you in hopes that they might be helpful for you in your own moments of anxiety as well. Here are 3 practices that helped me the most during my moments of anxiety this week. Number 1 is take some deep breaths. Now, this may sound super obvious or cheesy or cliche, but I have to tell you that it works. And I'm finding lately that especially in the middle of the night when my mind starts racing and I can't seem to slow it down, it really does help to take some deep breaths in and out. See, I was noticing that when I couldn't fall asleep, when I paid attention to my breath, it was really shallow. I wasn't breathing deeply because I was so anxious. It's kind of like I was holding my breath. So if I would deliberately take deep breaths in and out, it really did help me to get into a more relaxed state and provided some physical release of tension. Now, this is just one step, and I definitely wouldn't stop there, but it really is a helpful place to start. So when you notice anxiety in yourself, pay attention to your breathing. Take a deep breath in, then let it out, and repeat that a few times and see if it helps you to physically relax a bit. So the second thing that helped was to say a prayer of release and surrender. So there's a specific prayer I've been using lately that's really helping me with this, and it's from the book Get Your Life Back by John Eldredge. The words he prays are this: Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. So as he prays those words, he also asks himself, what do I need to let go of? And then he releases that to Jesus. Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. Now, this is not a one-time thing. We can't say one prayer of surrender and then release all of our anxiety about someone or something forever. But the reason the type of prayer like this is so important is that when we're feeling anxious, we have a pretty tight grip on something because we desperately want to change it or control it. So when we release it to Jesus, it's an act of trust and faith that Jesus has got this and he's got us. So we're releasing the situation to him as best as we can, recognizing that we are not in control and we're trusting in his goodness. And while we can make this a short and a quick prayer in the moment, and that's a great practice, but it's also really helpful to spend some time lingering in the presence of Jesus, asking him to help us to release our anxiety and our circumstances to him. So I'd really encourage you to spend some time in prayer and listening, allowing yourself to rest in Jesus' presence as you really surrender all of your circumstances to him. So the third practice is to fill your mind with words of hope instead of fear. So one thing I noticed in myself as I was experiencing anxiety, I had this question kind of rise up in me that said this: what are you feeding yourself? So as we release our anxiety and circumstances to Jesus, what are we putting in our minds in place of that? Because sometimes we need words of hope to fill in those spaces where fear had been speaking. So, just as an example, when I was feeling anxious this week about what was happening in our country, it was not helpful to keep filling my mind with what I was seeing on social media. Now, I'm not saying that we close our eyes to what's happening or pretend everything is okay. I don't think it was wrong for me to tune into the news or read a few articles about what was happening, but it's like there got to this point where I was just fixating on it and cycling through the same information over and over again. I was feeding my mind with fear. So I realized that I needed to step away from the headlines and the scrolling and give my soul some space. I took some deep breaths like we talked about. I said a prayer of release. Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. And then I decided to feed my mind with words of hope. So I put on some worship music, specifically the song King of Kings by Hillsong, which is a song we've done at our church many times. And as I listened to the words and I sang along, it recentered my heart as I remembered that Jesus is our hope. He is our only true King. And so I didn't have to be afraid. It really helped me to keep my eyes on Jesus and to remember what is really true. So, when you're feeling anxious, what are you feeding yourself? Is there some worship music that will speak truth into your anxious mind? Or maybe you have a few go-to passages of scripture that help you remember who Jesus is in your anxious moments. You might need to put down your phone or turn off the TV for a while and simply fill your mind with space and silence. So those are just 3 practices that have helped me. And when we're feeling anxious, there's not a magic fix. There's not one thing that's going to make it all better. But there are some things that we can do that will move us towards Jesus. Because even when life is scary or uncertain, He is our only hope. So as we keep our eyes on Him, we allow His presence to overshadow the anxious thoughts that take up space in our minds. So I hope that these simple practices can help you in your anxious moments. Take some deep breaths, say a prayer of release and surrender, and fill your mind with words of hope instead of fear. Keep going back to Jesus, asking Him to help you and to remind you of who He is and the hope that He gives. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Simple Spiritual Practices. If you want to receive a free printable for each practice in a weekly email, visit lindsaysturkey.com/free to sign up. This podcast is part of the New Hope Podcast Network, and production is done by Darren Hansen. You can check out all the podcasts on the network by visiting newhopechurch.cc/listen. Make sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode, and we'll be back with a new episode next week.